Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me once again in studio is Brad Miller, and I'll use his bio to introduce happily resigned former Army officer, Christ, Truth, Courage, Freedom. We've had a lot of great discussions in the past, Brad and I, and we're following up today to discuss the last point we left off on. And we discussed in the last interview, which was entitled Brad Miller Interview, a Declaration of Military Accountability and Foreign Influence Over U.S. Policy. And so I really wanted to start today with that point and what's happened since then. And I was reaching out earlier because I've been noticing a lot of stuff he's been posting and talking about. And I think there's, it's a rapidly growing number of people who are becoming aware of what I think is happening, but it just seems Brad really has an insight on what's going on for a lot of different reasons. So it's an honor to have you back in studio, brother. How are you?
First of all, great. Thanks again for having me back. We have had some great conversations. I think we've done 2 conversations previously. This would be the third, the second in studio.
You know, it's funny you say that. I thought there might have been 3 and I wasn't able to grab the other one, but it could just be a tagging issue.
Yeah.
But one was that one I just mentioned. And then there was the first one where we discussed the courage about resigning regarding the COVID shot.
Yeah. So, we've always had some fantastic conversations before. So yeah, looking to get back into it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me, man. And, obviously you've got some insights that most people don't have. Just things that probably more than you even let on your accounts and what you're talking about, so I'd like to get into this stuff with you on how you perceive these things, with the different fields of war, Epstein, how this all evolving. And one thing most important is, your view of Donald Trump, the 2-party illusion, how all this is evolving in a really, in a way, an entertaining way right now, in a very wild and crazy, which is one of the most alarming things for me, is that people are going to get lost in this reality TV version of what it is. But it is pretty chaotic, which makes me wonder whether, as we were briefly talking about off air, who's really calling these shots if they seem to be sort of destroying what was, what they built. Well, before we get to all of that, I'd like to start on the Declaration of Military Accountability and our last discussion about that and your Substack post and, actually let's start with, your brief introduction of, maybe the brief background military COVID point, and then that declaration, and let's go on to what has happened since then, in case they didn't see the last interviews.
Yeah. So, the abridged version of what has happened in the last couple of years. So I served for 19 years in the military, I spent a little bit more than 19 years in the Army on active duty. I attained the rank of lieutenant colonel. I was a battalion commander in the 101st Airborne Division at the time that the COVID shot mandate went into effect. Long story short, I was never going to comply with the mandate for a variety of reasons. One being my own health, but a lot of people think that that's the only reason. It's not. There was a much larger, more important reason. So, of course, I didn't want to take the shot for my own health, but there was a bigger reason, is that I knew that this was an operation. I knew that this was to target the American people, if not people across the globe, and I wasn't going to go along with it. Right. And I did, even in 2021, I thought that to go along with it would be to comply with treason, or at least to kind of involve oneself in what was a deliberately planned and executed treasonous operation. I wasn't going to go along with that. So I was fired from command, and shortly thereafter, I decided to resign altogether from the Army after a little bit more than 19 years of service, which means I did not hit the 20-year benchmark to qualify for retirement pension, etc. So I've been out of the Army now for almost 3 years. In September, it'll be 3 years. And since that time, I have continued to, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Be a voice of reason, or talk about government overreach, or here's what I would probably say. Try to get people to think more deeply, right, and conduct their own personal strategic assessment of the environment and exactly what's happening. Because I think a lot of people fail to do that. So here's the other thing. And this is where I think a military background can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. So I like to think that my military experience gives me a framework to think about these problems, a vocabulary to be able to communicate these ideas to myself and understand them, and then be able to share them with other people in a way that hopefully makes sense. Because at the end of the day, we're all in a war. Right. And if you think that you're not a combatant in that war, think again, because those who are trying to fight against us very much view all of us as combatants. Right. So you might as well just understand that out the gate. It's just that this war may look a little bit different than the way that we typically think about, war. Now, with that said, so I have a good buddy of mine who is still currently serving in the Navy. His name is Rob Green. He's a commander in the Navy, which would be the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel in the Army, which is the rank that I held before I left the Army. And he is still currently serving. Now, in 2023, he wrote a book called Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. And that book kind of detailed what was happening in the military with regard to these policies that were enacted in 2020, 2021, et cetera, mostly focusing on the COVID shot mandate, but it did go deeper than, there were other policies the military enacted during that time period besides just the COVID shot mandate. That book, Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines, was published by Rob Green on July 4th of 2023. So fast forward a couple of months, and on New Year's Day of 2024, a group of us put out this document, which consisted of an open letter to the American public that basically said, and then there were 231 individuals who signed on to this letter. The 231 of us are not going to stand by and allow senior military leaders to destroy the armed forces. And so there were a group of us that were behind that document, but the one who wrote the initial draft, who had the idea and wrote the initial draft, was Rob Green. So in some ways, that open letter to the American public, which we came to call the Declaration of Military Accountability, in some ways it was this continuation of his book that had been published a couple of months prior. Anyway, so his book comes out. First of all, he publishes the book as an active duty officer. He doesn't publish it anonymously. He doesn't publish it under a pen name. He publishes it in his own name. So what's the reaction from senior military leadership? Silence. Now, why? I mean, I would assume it's because they knew that we don't even want to touch this. As soon as we try to refute it, we're already lending it credibility. So don't touch it. So 6 months later, when our Declaration of Military Accountability comes out, which, oh, by the way, I emailed on January 1st, 2024. I emailed to senior Pentagon officials early in the morning on New Year's Day. What was the response? Silence. So it's weird because, again, it was as if they knew, just don't even engage with that, because as soon as you engage with it, you're lending credibility to the message that these guys are putting forward. Well, now fast forward another year and a half. So 2024 was our major push for substantive reform in the military. Did we get there? No. Does that mean that we accomplished nothing? Well, no, that's not necessarily true either. And we brought a lot of awareness to these issues. Right. So then what happens? Trump comes into office. I'm sure we'll talk about that. There's a new Secretary of Defense. Some superficial changes have been made in the military, and we can talk about that. I would say they haven't gone nearly far enough. And now, just recently, within the last maybe 10 days or so, we've come to find out that Rob Green, who wrote the book that I mentioned, and then was the primary author behind the Declaration of Military Accountability, he is still serving in the Navy. Well, now the Navy has opened up an investigation into him for some language that he has used on his publicly, in which he has referred to certain senior military officials as domestic enemies of the Constitution. And so what I would say is, yeah, okay, that's pretty strong language, but it's also true. It's also 100% true. But the other thing is that he has been very consistent in his message. This is the same message that was in his book. It's the same message that we talk about in the Declaration of Military Accountability, or that we have mentioned in many interviews that we have given. So nothing's changed, but now they've gone after him and they have opened up this investigation into him. So on the front of all things military accountability, I would just use this as an example to show that we are still very much in the trenches in that fight.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, what comes to my mind is obviously, what do you think changed? Now, before you answer, I mean, it's interesting that, my thought on why, let's say I guess during the Biden administration, there was no, silence, there's no response. I think, regardless of whether it was Trump or Biden or anybody else, at that moment, I think, just like you're highlighting or insinuating or, hinting at, is that they didn't want anyone, they didn't want, whether Streisand effect or anything else. They didn't want this to get attention in any way, because I think they recognize, as we did, everyone did, that we're at a moment right there where people were more willing, and I think it's gotten better in the way I see it, worse for them now. But despite their efforts, the people were willing to start asking certain questions. We were willing to look into these things we hadn't in the past. And so I think they were just trying to get away from that. Now, I want your thought on why you think, because in my opinion, the circumstances are even worse for them right now. Why do you think during Trump's administration now are they deciding to go after him? What changed?
Yeah. Well, if we talk about under the Biden administration, now the first thing that I would say here is I know you know this, but just for those out there who are listening, and I'm assuming much of your audience already gets this, but just to say it, just to map this out. So ultimately, I believe that, you know, Trump and Biden still take their orders from the same networks, of course, but they do play different roles and they have different scripts. And so, but a lot of people within the public, to include within the military, unfortunately enough, they don't necessarily see that.
Right.
So during the Biden administration, or when Lloyd Austin was the Secretary of Defense, if you were on our side, you felt that you were within a hostile environment because you believed that this administration, meaning the Biden administration, or this Secretary of Defense, meaning Lloyd Austin, they're hostile to the Constitution. They are hostile to the rights of service members, et cetera. But then there may be this assumption that that's going to change with the new administration.
Okay.
You know, with Trump in office or with Pete Hegseth. There are a lot of people within the military accountability movement and within the public at large that just assumed things would change. And now they haven't necessarily changed. But what did anything change? Well, yeah, I would say there were some superficial changes that have happened. So, for example, on January 20th, so during his inauguration speech, Trump did include some language in that speech in which he mentioned, you know, bringing back these service members whose careers were harmed because of the COVID shot mandate. Within a week, there was an executive order that was published that basically said the same thing. So then, you know, now Pete Hegseth is in the driver's seat in the Pentagon, you know, as the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, you know, his office starts putting out more memos, and they put together this process to bring people back into the service who left over the COVID shot military or the COVID shot mandate, those who left either voluntarily or involuntarily. Now, what I would say is the process that they have put in place is somewhat, well, first of all, it's very incomplete. And the rhetoric around what they have supposedly done is quite hollow. So they're saying they've done much more than they've actually done, but they have.
Well, you flesh that out for me. In what way? Like, are they lying?
So have they put together a process to allow people who lost their careers to the COVID shot mandate to come back? Yes. Now, what does that look like? So if you, let's say you're me and you and I, let's say I were to say, okay, let me go back and let me finish out my time in the military. What do I have to do? So there is a process that I can apply for and try to get accepted back into the military. But there are a couple of things we got to take into consideration. So first of all, they're going to look at me and they're going to say, did you leave voluntarily or involuntarily? Okay. Well, good question. Because what about unlawful coercion?
Yeah.
You know, so what if you were coerced out, but you voluntarily left? So I resigned. But I resigned after being relieved of command. Well, now the Secretary of Defense has actually come out and said that the COVID shot mandate, which he characterizes as, you know, having been implemented by the previous administration, which technically is true, but whatever. He has said that mandate was implemented unlawfully.
Right. So it shouldn't matter.
But I was relieved of command. Unlawful. That means I was relieved of command unlawfully, but I resigned. Okay. But why was I backed into a corner to where I had to either comply with an unlawful command, give an unlawful command to my subordinates, or resign? Why was I ever placed in that situation? So according to the military, I left voluntarily, not involuntarily. And so the DOD wants to focus on this number of about 8,600. So DOD will tell you, hey, there were about 8,600 service members who were kicked out against their will. And for those 8,600, they will offer them back pay, and then also they will credit them as time served, the time lost between the day that they left service and the day that they would be reinstated.
Okay.
So if that's a 3-year time period, they would credit them. First of all, they would pay them for those 3 years. and then credit them towards retirement or whatever those 3 years as if they had been served. Now that's a great thing.
Yeah.
But you're making you're making this very clear distinction between those who were voluntarily kicked out, which is only 8,600, and then the 100K plus that were voluntarily kicked out. You're drawing that distinction where I think that distinction is not quite as clear as you want to make it. So, and the other thing is, even when they try to give the back pay to this group that they consider to be those that were involuntarily kicked out, they're doing a bunch of calculations to try and determine what salary offsets they should be to decrease the actual back pay that they're going to give you,
Right.
So all told, are people banging on the door of the military to get back in? No.
Right.
No, they don't want to enter back into that abusive relationship. And then also, so we have, if you count all of our active duty troops and your guard troops and your reserve troops, it's over 2 million. So 8,600 out of 2 million doesn't seem like a very large number.
Right.
But 100, but again, that's the number DOD wants you to focus on, because that is the number of troops that were kicked out against their own will.
Right.
This number of 100K, which may be a conservative estimate,
I imagine. Yeah.
well, obviously that's a much larger percentage of the overall force.
Right.
But even that, so of that number, how many have come back into the military so far? 13.
Wow.
So 13 out of 8,600 is a tiny percentage. 13 out of 100K is a much, much, much smaller percentage.
I think, tell me if you share this view. It seems obvious that if you look at the real main distinction between those two groups, it's one of them that seems to act. There's plenty. It's hard to decide. If somebody wanted to stay and stick it out to make a point, there's something to be said about that. But the people that decided to resign, there's principle in that.
Yeah.
That you're saying, I'm willing to sacrifice my everything in order to stand with this principle. That terrifies a dishonest, unjust system, right? And I think that's what it really comes down to, or just a financial motive to recognize, hey, if we lean into this number, we can pretend like, save all of the effort that might, those are my opinions on it.
I would agree with both of those. Yeah. So how do you create action and then make it look like you're doing more than you are? Oh, look at this process we put in. Look at all these overtures that we're making to these people that were wronged. But they're not actually doing nearly as much as they want you to believe that they're doing.
Right. And I bet you they knew they wouldn't come back as well, for the obvious reasons.
Of course. And then also from the perspective of DOD, they also, I think they don't really want you back.
Right.
And so why? Because the military is not done doing the type of unjust actions that they did over the last couple of years. That hasn't ended.
Because it doesn't change based on partisanship. It's something that we
does not change.
Share.
Right.
Well, so in regard to the declaration of accountability, so you pretty much already touched on it, but is there any other way that you think? So basically, you described it as there's a group of people in there that really want this and believe in it, but that at least in the beginning felt that Trump's administration would be the thing that brought that change on. First part of it, where do you feel they are right now? Are they starting to feel disillusioned by that? And have there been any positive movements from that?
Yeah. So the whole military accountability was more of an effort than an actual organization. Okay. And a lot of people sometimes they would come to me or whomever, and they would say, hey, you guys should create some sort of, organization. And we never quite went that route because people are busy. They got other endeavors they're involved in, but also we didn't even 100% agree on this issue. Now, here's where we did agree. We knew that what was happening was wrong, and we largely shared a lot of the same goals that we wanted to see achieved. We did not necessarily agree, though, in our entire strategic picture of the environment or the pathway to achieve those goals.
Right.
That's where you started to have. That's right. That's where you started to have some strategic differences of agreement, and that's okay.
Right.
But that can also create some tension. Now, a little bit of tension can be healthy. A little bit more than what is healthy can be, slightly disruptive. And so, within our groups, there would be some conversations, and sometimes those conversations would get a little bit tense as to kind of not necessarily the goals, but kind of the strategic read on what exactly is happening. Who are the who are the influencers or the interlocutors that we should be engaging with in dialogue to try and achieve this or this? Because here's what was happening during that same time period. We had people giving a lot of interviews, even on some pretty big platforms. We had people who were writing op-eds or were writing Substack posts. We had people who were in DC engaging with members of Congress, which achieved very, very little, by the way.
Tends to, yeah.
There were court cases, which I don't want to say achieved zero ground. Some of them were helpful. There were some victories, but on the whole, it was very little. So you get to a point where it's like, okay, we've approached within DOD, haven't gotten a lot of support. Certainly didn't get a lot of support from the president, meaning Biden. I would say we still haven't gotten a lot of support from Trump. We haven't gotten a lot of support from the legislature or from the judicial branch. So where do you go? In fact, this was Rob Greene's assessment when he decided to write a letter to the American people, hence the Declaration of Military Accountability. We can't get any help from any of the branches of government. How do you appeal higher? Well, you take it to we the people. That was the driving idea behind this open letter to the public, the Declaration of Military Accountability. So where are we now? Yeah, and I can only kind of speak for myself, but I know that I know some people within this basic effort have some slightly different opinions than I do, and that's okay. But I do think that people are starting to maybe reassess their read on the strategic environment and at least say, hey, maybe things aren't quite the way that I thought they were going to be.
And it's just very healthy and positive, and I get it. I mean, I get and completely understand why somebody would want to hope for the best outcome.
Sure,
and we should always do that, right? Just don't let that completely overtake what's actually happening. And I think that now is a very clear time. There's plenty of, we'll go over some of them in a moment. There's plenty of indications that this is just not, that there's a lot of narrative statements that just don't match what's actually happening. So I'm glad, I'm hoping that people are starting to see that, because I'm glad you didn't do it in organization direction. I think that right now it's very easy for these things to get co-opted, especially with something that large. Right. I think reaching out to the American people, I think we said in the last interview, was the right way to go, because that's where the change is happening. So
you said something very important that I actually want to touch on. So from day one, which would be January 1st, 2024. I mean, that's the day that our Declaration of Military Accountability, which we call the DMA, the day that it hit the streets. And it created a lot of momentum immediately. And I remember thinking on that very day, there's a risk here, because if you want to look at this as a partisan issue, which I don't, but a lot of people do, if you want to look at this as a partisan issue, we have just given you fodder that reinforces that. Now, we were very much trying to keep ourselves kind of apolitical, because a lot of the people that signed this document were still currently serving. So the document on its face had nothing to do with one political party or the other. It was very neutral, very apolitical in that regard. But people are people, and even people who serve in the military, I mean, they still vote. They still have, they may still be affiliated with one party or another or whatever. And so when you look at the environment and you say, you know what, even if it was unintentional, we have put some fuel into this engine that reinforces this kind of two-party dynamic.
You mean because you released it under one administration, so the perception is that it's against
the perception could be that this was anti-Biden, which we never said. I would never say that anyway, because I think the problem is much broader. But even those who might have felt that way wouldn't have necessarily said that. So this would be unintentional. But here's where you run the risk, though, of being potentially co-opted, even if you don't mean to. And this is something that I think happens all the time, is people are sincere, but their effort that they are involved in can be twisted to serve a certain purpose.
I think that's most of what's happening today.
Sure, absolutely.
I really do.
And so this was something that I realized. I remember thinking about this on the evening of January 1st, 2024, because we held, so what happened on that day was I took the DMA, which is a one-pager. People can find it, by the way, at militaryaccountability.net.
It'll be included in the show notes. So you can check it out.
And so I took that document and I emailed it to can't remember exactly how many, 12 or 15 senior military officers, some of whom are named in the DMA specifically because of the egregious actions they had committed.
Right.
Now, this document is not addressed to them. It's addressed to the American public.
Right.
But we sent it to these senior military leaders basically to say, hey, we've written this document. We've signed it. This document is about ready to hit the streets, just so you know.
Right.
And I sent that. Now, why did I send it? Well, Rob and I spoke about this, and we agreed that even though a bunch of us have signed it, you know, Rob's the primary author, but a lot of us had a hand in kind of the final revisions, et cetera, but that I might be the best candidate to put it out there because I was no longer serving. So I'm less of a target. I'm not in uniform.
Yeah.
And because, you know, maybe I had a little bit of street cred because I'd been a battalion commander who had been fired and then had resigned at 19 years.
101st, no less. I mean,
Yeah.
that has prominence.
So in any case, I was like, yeah, I'll put it out there. I will be the one to send an email to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you know, the highest ranking uniformed officer, and other generals and admirals, and say, hey, heads up, this is about ready to hit the streets. So I did that at 4 a.m. DC time, January 1st, 2024, when most of America was either asleep or still partying from, you know, New Year's Eve. And I turned right around, and then on my, you know, my Twitter or my X account, I made a post within a couple of minutes, and I put a screenshot of the DMA. And that post in the last year and a half has had almost 5 million views.
Yeah.
But that is the exact moment that document would have been publicly visible for the first time. And then we took it and we hung it on a website and you know, and then we further socialized it from there.
Real quick, 5 million views. I mean, that's viral. I mean, that the world saw that, you know, and that means, and 5 million views is just that means far more than that actually digested that, shared that, took screenshots of themselves and shared it. What I'm saying is that it's really interesting to see how that can happen. And that's the point, that's where the change is happening. People wanted this. They know that. And I think it's just an important line to show that, I mean, it shows you the government does not represent the American people in a very clear way.
That's right. That's right. And at the time, I think at that time I had maybe, I want to say less than 5,000 followers. I had a pretty small following on Twitter at the time.
Still got that. That's crazy.
But it generated that. And I mean, it started immediately. So that night at like, I don't know, 8 p.m. Eastern, you know, if I put it out at 4 a.m., so, you know, roughly at 8 p.m. Eastern, right? The same day. So 16 hours later, we held a Twitter space that just had a ton of people get involved and speak. We had members of Congress in there. It was really crazy.
Nice.
But this is when I realized if we're not careful, this could be used in a way to reinforce some ideas that I'm not out there trying to promote. Now, at the same time, I had to also say, there are people who can use this to reinforce this two-party dynamic, you know, the elephant versus donkey smokescreen. But I can't let that affect what I am trying to do, because I do believe that there should be military accountability. I don't want to use it to try and paint Democrats as bad and therefore Republicans as good. Right. That's not helpful either. And I don't want people to take what we're doing and try and do that, but I can't not do it just because somebody might take our words and twist them to mean something that we're not actually saying.
Well, that you have to. I mean, that's about principle, you know. And so, but nonetheless, even though, that always happens, as you know. Always. No matter what movement you look at, there's always some element to co-opt it, whether from government or something else. But it still has the positive effect is still there, which I think, especially when you have an administration shooting themselves in both feet, it makes it easier for people to see, even if they first accepted it as that's the one side bad. Now they're seeing the other side of it, you know? And so that's why this is so important to keep this momentum going, because maybe people will stumble back through this and recognize now even the full picture as opposed to only half of it the first time.
So it's interesting because, so fast forward and we get closer to, to election season. Now, do I believe that elections are free and fair? No, of course not. Did I vote in the 2024 presidential election? No.
Right.
Did I vote in 2020? No. Did I vote in 2016? No. So it's kind of funny because, like, I've never been a Trump. I've never voted for Trump, but I've also never voted against Trump. You know? Anyway, yeah. So whatever. But and I will also say, because I get called a Trump hater a lot.
Yeah.
But if you forced me to pick in the last 3 elections, between Trump and any of his opponents, I would have picked Trump all 3 times.
You know, I had a similar conversation with Catherine Austin Fitts for similar reasons. And there's an argument that could be made, is the way I framed it then.
Yeah.
That if you're looking at objectively at what we have only right in front of us, then yeah. But my point is the same, is that is operating within the broken game. The only way not to play is or to win is not to play.
That's right. Yeah, I don't play rigged games.
Right.
But the reason I say that is because so take what I just said about the DMA and my realization, within the strategic environment, hey, there is a risk here that we at least have to manage, So fast forward, and now we're in kind of deep into campaign season. And people were coming at me and they were saying, how come you're always so critical of Trump? You never criticize Biden or Kamala. And so I put out a couple of posts on X about this, because I was like, because I thought, I was very, very convinced that they were going to put Trump back in. I'm not saying I necessarily realized that a year out, but I would say 7 or 8 months out, I was convinced they were going to put Trump
I think we
in.
shared the same thought in that last interview. I mean, I thought the point was, or when timing might be right, but the point is, I think we've shared this thought that, not like we're psychic, but that it makes sense that Trump would be like with the COVID point, that he's going to allow the right, like give the people the excuse to dismiss what's happening.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I also, I said this on the day of, so July 13th of last year in Butler, Pennsylvania. Yeah. I mean, I thought that was staged. I still think it's staged. I said that the day of.
Yeah.
So that day I knew for sure, oh, they're going with Trump. I also thought that, I mean, there's been some theatrics with Elon now, in the last month or so, but they also weren't going to have Elon, because Elon is such a pivotal player as well in this whole game.
Yeah.
They're not going to have Elon. They're not going to have Elon back, the guy that's going to come out on the wrong end of the election. So anyway, but people would say, why do you criticize Trump and you don't criticize Biden or Kamala? And I would say, well, I think Kamala is running so first of all, Biden was a stooge all along. He was supposed to be a stooge. He was playing his role, whether he was doing that deliberately or whether that just is whatever. And I think Kamala, I don't even think put together a real campaign.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think she was running to win.
Yeah,
she probably knew. So in my mind, it was, if I expend a lot of energy on her when she's basically a decoy, but expending energy on her is to basically push in the direction of the psyop.
Right.
Whereas to push back against Trump is to push against the direction of the psyop. Even though if you were to ask me between the two of them, which I prefer Trump 100 times over. But I don't have to pick between the two of them.
Right. But by design is your point. That's exactly how it's meant to work.
Yes.
And, and obviously feel free to question this. We're not psychic, but the obvious point is that it's just logic. And you can see the way this goes, what suits, if we're correct about the bigger picture, what best suits the empire. Right. And this is exactly what seems to line up. But I would even more so add to that your criticisms are aimed I can't speak to everything you've said, but not at Trump as a person, but at Trump who is running the government. Yeah. Right. So it's regardless whether her or him, I bet your criticism would have been the same.
That's right.
That's how
exactly. So there's this idea that I've been communicating, and thinking a lot about recently. And I even did a video about it recently, but it kind of boils down to principles first and then people. And so what I mean by that is not that people aren't important, of course, but figure out what your principles are. And then as you stand on your principles and as you live in alignment with those principles, you will naturally find the people who are similarly minded.
I love it.
But when you seek to congregate with certain people first, what happens when you then realize their principles aren't your principles? So now take that one step further. What can you extrapolate from that? So think about, this is why populism is so dangerous as a political movement, right? Because it's not that charisma is bad, but there's got to be some character behind the charisma. Some
substance, yeah.
Otherwise, you might be an inspirational person, but what are you inspiring people to do? Are you inspiring them to do something that is great and noble, helpful for themselves and helpful for others? Or are you just inspiring them to do something that pushes things along in a predetermined way,
right,
but has nothing to do with, the interests of the American people? And so, you take a populist movement or something and you take that to its extreme and you have demagoguery, or you have a cult of personality and people are so wrapped up in the personality of this figure And then there's no guiding philosophy there. There's no bedrock of values that some guiding policy is rooted within.
It's exactly what we're dealing with, which I know we agree on, you know, and it is, I mean, and it's not a secret. I mean, even right now, I think the Trump MAGA movement, whatever, is grappling with this, the honest elements in there, which I think is largely majority. I think most people were tricked into thinking that's what they wanted, you know, and now they're grappling with this, the very clear many characters we could call out by name if we wanted to. They're just blind support Trump, will change what they said yesterday if Trump tells them to that day. You know, and that's terrifying. But let's get into some overlapping points. I'll let you decide right now. Do you want to go in the direction? Because I'm enjoying the conversation we're having, sort of a higher view of the PSYOP, right? And how it's being played, bigger than partisanship. So do you want to get into some foreign policy discussion about military locations, or you want to get into Epstein and, you know, the different parts of who Trump is? What would you rather talk about?
Let's talk about kind of in line with what we've been talking about the last couple of minutes. Let's maybe talk about this supposed 12-day war between Israel and Iran.
Okay.
If you want to talk about that. So I got some thoughts and then we can go wherever. So first of all, even if you just take what we've been told, even just in mainstream sources or whatever. So Israel conducts a strike, which they call preemptive or whatever, but they conduct a strike. Now there is retaliation coming from Iran, which results in this 12-day war. But in the midst of this 12-day war, there are strikes performed by U.S. service members, you know? And so, which makes us completely a belligerent in that war. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. I also believe that, and we're still under a ceasefire, but I saw yesterday that that Israel was striking Syria. So
we can talk about that today too if you want.
So first of all, I don't in any way think that we've seen the end of this.
I agree.
I also think from a big picture geopolitically, we're going to continue to see the stage set for war. I would also say, if you look at what is the domestic counterpart to the push for war abroad, and I would say that is increased surveillance here at home. And so when you think about just the digital control grid, when you think about the way in which AI can increase the sophistication of the digital control grid, then I think those are things that we have to worry about.
So you mean in the overlap being that are they just two parts of the same agenda, or that the war is there to justify that? How do you see them connected?
Exactly. So so let's just use a very simple example. So the border, so immigration, okay? But then also you hear these stories, and it's like 2003 all over again, but you hear these stories about supposed sleeper cells that can infiltrate through our border because our border is so porous, et cetera. So first and foremost, and this is something we have to realize, is that when you think about problems and solutions kind of in the Hegelian sense, just because you recognize that the problem has been engineered to lead towards a predetermined solution doesn't mean that the problem isn't a problem.
Yes, important point.
Right. So if I think that there is some complexity behind the border issue, I'm not saying that the border is not a problem. It is. What I'm saying is the same people that are causing the problem are trying to give you a solution. And maybe we should be cautious about that. But anyway, but if we set that aside and we just think about if we have some sort of adversary that we have painted up as, hey, that's the new boogeyman. In this case, you know, let's just say Iran. Then that can certainly be used to try and scare the people into accepting new increased security measures back at home.
And both being very real.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I call them like a landmine, like in a hypothetical or a metaphorical sense, where, you know, people will, like, same thing like with the two-party illusion or anything for that matter, is that people tend to break away. There's these moments of awareness, and there are just landmines and traps laid for them that they fall right into and thinking they've discovered the new thing. QAnon was like that, right? Where people thought, oh, they discovered Q, and now they can see everything. And even though that was just the first trap laid the moment you pull your head out of the problem. I think that's what a lot of this stuff is they want to believe that, you know, like my point is that's the point you made, is that the landmine there being, you know, the idea that that's fake, as opposed to recognizing that, yes, that's a real problem, but they're using it to trap you here. They set that there so they dismiss the whole thing.
That's right.
It's a partisan manipulation. And I think it is wildly present right now But again, I think people are starting to sort of like awaken from that. So right now, on that same point, look out for those mines I'm talking about, because they're laid everywhere to trap you right back into it.
So, I put a social media post out, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and I said, and this will resonate with people who have done their homework into like fundamentalist Islamic terror, right? And I said something like, scratch an Islamic terrorist and you'll find the CIA or Mossad beneath.
Right.
Keep scratching and you'll find MI6, because if you look into the history of that, so the CIA and Mossad, a lot of them kind of learned their dirty tricks from MI6.
MI6 does not get enough attention for how intertwined. I mean, it's funny because Matt Ehret's a writer for TLAV, and he's done a lot of work on us, opened my eyes to that deeper background. I don't think it's hard to tell in any one of the situations sometimes or often which one is the real, like people discuss whether it's Israel controlling the US or US controlling Israel. It's that kind of dynamic. And I think MI6 just has a tendency to not be involved in that thought process, which is a problem. They're very prevalent.
Yeah. So I will tell you my thought on that, because I sometimes push back a little bit against people who say Israel controls the United States. So here's what I would say. I'm not saying, maybe I'm wrong, but I would say it's not so much that Israel controls the United States as it is that Israel and the United States are both controlled by some network that is out there. And I tend to think a lot of that goes back to MI6 and kind of the British establishment. And by that, I don't necessarily mean the monarchy per se, but more like the city of London. And this nexus of
more of a globalist idea.
International finance, corporations, even secret societies, et cetera. But anyway.
No, I mean, that's an important comment. So is that what you mean when the background, or were you referencing something else? Like what do we see behind that, like calling those shots? Is that what you meant?
Yeah. So just, because right now I think there is this idea that Israel is the center of the globalist empire. And I would say, I think it's more maybe an avatar of the globalist empire. Well,
the easiest way to make that clear for somebody who's only just stepped into this is that really, the point is about Zionism, not the state of Israel, I'm sure we agree on. But to your point, Zionism was, existed, but the Balfour Declaration from the UK, that's what started Israel. So you can clearly see that there's more going on there. The hard part is that people, like especially today, there's a lot of, people seeking awareness and information, but they kind of woke up like 2016, 2020, and they don't really dive into the background. I mean, myself, everyone I think does that. Like even myself, I find things that I stumble into that kind of were like before where I started doing this work. And you go, wow, I didn't even you still have this weird framing of that you didn't even question because it's from a different time. And we all are going through that. I think cognitive dissonance is a hard problem where there's the people want to run away from it when it becomes contradictory, But the bigger problem I think comes down to whoever's driving that bus. I would argue that I do think Zionism is one of the chief issues of our time.
Totally. And I think that it is alive and well. So you mentioned the Balfour Declaration, which goes all the way back to World War I times, 1917. But some of these ideas already pre-existed that. You got Theodore Herzl, and I mean, you got the Schofield Reference Bible, because obviously there's a huge huge movement of Christian Zionism within a lot of the evangelical churches, which are very influential in the United States. And it's a lot of, and I mean, I say this as a Christian, but just within greater Christianity and those who profess to be Christians here in the West, but primarily in the United States, you have a lot of mostly Protestants, and within that kind of large umbrella, mostly evangelical dispensationalist Protestants, that they believe they have a moral obligation to unconditionally support this Middle Eastern state that, has been around for, 80 years.
It's wild.
It is wild.
It's inherently contradictory when you look at the basic elements of the facts.
It is historically. So that thought, that idea, I would say is historically and geopolitically illiterate. And biblically, for those who want to go there too, because I would say that too.
100% agree. Yeah. Well, so this thought stems through a lot of what we're going to talk about. So taking it back to Iran, since you started with that point. What I'm showing on the screen is just Iran faces. This is a recent article from yesterday. Iran faces August deadline to accept a comprehensive nuclear deal or face renewed UN sanctions. So, at a finer point, where do you see this going? Because you're well versed on this. It's absurd, in my opinion, to think that Iran in any way takes what the U.S. or Israel is putting forward as serious. They've violated everything they've ever done in every one of these dynamics, including with Iran. So again, with this kind of floated, like, you better do what we ask, or which is framed as negotiation before this deadline. So just where do you see this going? You know, what do you think is going to happen next? You you left off with kind of the bombing of the Qatar base. Then they, at this point, have been doing little bombings here and there, which aren't really getting much coverage or disputed. So where do you see it going?
Yeah. So, you know, there were these supposed strikes that that U.S. service members, you know, engaged in the 3 supposed nuclear sites within Iran.
Real quickly, I just saw a report saying 2 of the 3 are now shown to completely not be destroyed. One of the claims
obliterated.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, remember that. So anyway, so there was a response. There was an Iranian response, supposedly with some U.S. bases in Qatar. They supposedly called ahead. It was just maybe one of these face-saving measures.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
So then there's the ceasefire. Right. And now we're however many weeks, I don't know, 3 weeks or so into the ceasefire. Will that hold? And no, I don't think it will. So how will it be broken? And will we potentially see a false flag used as a pretext to potentially break the ceasefire? I don't know, but it's something we always have to be aware of.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
The other thing that I think is interesting is, and I know people have differing opinions on this, but it bears some discussion, or at least people kind of, you know, parsing through this in their own mind. So when we think about the globalist, whatever the structure of the globalist empire is, you know, is that largely a Western construct, or is it more global? And are countries that are considered to be antagonistic to the West, are they foils to this empire, or are they part of it? Now I'll tell you my assumption. I'm not saying I know for sure, but my read currently is I tend to think they're part of it. So I tend to think that Iran or China or Russia, maybe in North Korea, that they are part of this, but that they have a role to play, and that within that they are supposed to appear, you know, antagonistic to the West.
Interesting thought. I mean, I think it's an important thought to consider, because here's the way I look at it from like the COVID overlap, is that very clearly we saw a lot of supposedly adversarial countries lockstep in an agenda, right? But that doesn't necessarily have to prove that they are not adversarial in other ways. You know, my mind was, I think all of these governments, I have a very poor opinion of governments in general, would be willing to do very many things to better have control over our lives of their peoples, respectively. And so they'll all go, yes, we'll accept this, you know, we'll all go in this direction, but then still didn't agree at certain points, still vied, you know, back behind the scenes about different, many different points. And so that's what I see it as, is they're willing to come together if they can use that to control us. But at the end of the day, they're not really on the same team, or they might not be. So I do agree that makes sense within that possible.
And I do think that it doesn't have to be a clean either or.
Right,
so either China and Russia and Iran take their orders from the same, you know, party that gives the orders to Trump, for example, or they're totally antagonistic. I don't know that it necessarily has to be that cleanly either.
Right. I think they'll take what they can when they can. I think that most governments will.
But I do think that they are within the globalist spheres of influence to some degree.
Right.
To what degree, I'm not exactly sure, but I do think that Iran, therefore, may have a role to play. Now, do they maybe push back against that role? Sure, maybe. But I also think that from the globalist perspective, I think they want war. I think we're kind of seeing the winds blow in that direction, which is unfortunate. But I think that means that we just maybe have to be, you know, prepared for that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the main point that I think a lot of people, Jason Bassler, for example, and they're basically just saying, you know, in a larger kind of sprawling sense, I support the peoples of Iran. I support the peoples of Syria.
Sure. Yeah,
I don't support the governments of any of these places. And that's kind of the distinction we need to start making. You know, take action that is in the interest of the peoples of these places, not the government structures. But our government, like all of them, have framed this in a way that, you know, that is the representation of the people, and that's just not the truth.
Yeah. So 2 points on that, because that should be the way that we almost look at all geopolitical situations. And so when we saw this 12-day war between Israel and Iran, which largely, and I don't want to, so I think when things like that happen, because some people don't, but I think the missiles are largely real. Some people don't. Some people think
I agree with that.
And I also think that there is a, I think atrocity propaganda can be a real thing.
Absolutely.
So you can take something that happens and then you can amplify it, and you can compound the effects of a true atrocity that occurred, and you can maximize it, you know.
And just be honest, and absolutely faking entire events. So nobody should be pretending like we don't have historical evidence of that happening. It's very real.
That's right. So Gulf of Tonkin, of course, is an event that didn't happen. Anyway,
I agree. No. Well, just so it's clear, no way am I suggesting that that everything, there's plenty of atrocities happening that we can prove.
That's right.
It's just considering that possibility is always important.
That's right. So people who question these events, I get why they're questioning them.
Right.
But I also think it's dangerous to assume that every time there's a supposed missile exchange between two countries that it's always fake.
Yeah, just don't. We shouldn't assume anything. That's the point. Is we should consider these thoughts, but facts are what matter.
And so to that point, so during this 12-day war, and I would have this discussion with friends of mine, and I would say, you don't have to pick a side between Israel and Iran.
Right.
You don't have to, but you can side with the people. You can express solidarity, or whether you want to call it, sympathy or whatever, with the people on both sides that are being impacted by what is happening.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's where we need to stand with this. And, people will always have different perspectives and side on different ways. But if we start putting our lot in, in the flag next to your bio, we're falling into the psyop. I mean, that's what I really think it is.
You are.
But your point is important about the bigger picture, about whether they have another role, whether it's Iran or somebody else. And we definitely should consider that, because it's easy to fall into, Iran's the one pushing back against the one we see committing genocide, so they're the ones on the good guy side. It's a dangerous assumption to make. So
it is a dangerous assumption. And you can reinforce that dialectical engine by pushing hard against Israel, because all you're doing is you're still fueling the dialectical engine between, in this case, Israel and Iran. And I think a lot of times the best way to deal with those types of situations is to remove yourself from that unnecessary dialectic.
Yeah. Right. That's exactly. You're being forced. It's the false binary.
It's the false binary.
Don't make a choice, right? Don't feel like you have to.
Yeah. You don't have to.
Right. But so on the Syria point, because all of these are interconnected. Let's put it this way. My opinion is this is the extension of the greater Israel genocide. That's what this really comes down to, is these are obvious agendas of Israel in the context of, in this direct point. But so I'm showing an article I put out, or show about Israel in regard to Syria. As Israel further occupies Syria, Western-backed ISIS patch-wearing terrorists begin executions. It's amazing that anybody can even try to dismiss that at this point, because it's live streamed like everywhere else, and ISIS patches and all. But so right now, what I think is interesting is we're seeing the extension of this. And now you mentioned the recent bombings. We're seeing they're claiming now Israel's now occupying certain areas, even though in my opinion, they've already pretty much occupied most of Syria. It's like this weird kind of narrative on top of what's already been going on. They play a clip really quickly of Netanyahu, and then we can comment on what's happening. Solomon Ahmed frames it as Netanyahu announces Israel's going to occupy southern Syria. Netanyahu announces occupation from the Golan Heights to the Druze Mountain area. Welcome to Greater Israel. I agree with that.
מבקש לעדכן אתכם מה עשינו בסוריה ומה נעשה בסוריה. אנחנו קבענו מדיניות ברורה. פירוז המרחב דרומית לדמשק, מהגולן ועד אזור הר הדרוזים. זה קו אחד. הקו השני, שמירה על האחים של האחים שלנו, הדרוזים בהר הדרוזים. שני הדברים האלה הופרו על ידי המשטר בדמשק. הוא שלח צבא דרומית לדמשק, לתוך האזור שצריך להיות מפורז, והוא התחיל לטבוח בדרוזים.
So what's frustrating for me on that is, first of all, the idea of occupying, which they're already doing, but interesting point of always seemingly using the Druze population as like this, we're saving them, when they themselves will speak up and say, we want nothing to do with Israel. But just your thoughts on the larger point here on the narrative is always that we're coming in to save the day. And what's Israel doing with Syria? Give me your big picture view on this.
Yeah. So we mentioned false flags a few minutes ago. But what is a false flag? I'm not saying this is a false flag, but what I'm saying is a false flag is just one type of invented pretext. So you find a pretext, or you invent a pretext to supposedly create a justification for you to, engage in some action. So, and I think that's kind of what we see here. Oh, look at what's going on with the Druze. Israel, we've got to get involved. And so whether it's a false flag, but because we've seen this type of pretext used before as well, where you'll have some country who says, hey, we've got we have ethnic brothers. In this case, I think he uses the term brothers of our brothers. But anyway, we have ethnic brothers that are being, genocided or are being repressed by this other country. Now we've got to get involved.
Right.
So in any case, it's a pretext that is either identified or invented to justify then, some action.
What do you think their objective is, whether Israel or the United States involved with Syria, outside of the Russia dynamic, which seems to still be present, but now that Assad is gone, diminished, but what do you think their objective is?
Well, I do think that your assessment about the greater Israel, that is something that I think we all have to have our eyes on, because when you look at the modern borders of Israel compared to what greater Israel would look like, it is, first of all, it's eye-opening. Now, you just mentioned Russia. So here's the other thing about Israel. So whether it's geographically, whether it is culturally, it's kind of this, it's a hinge between the East and the West.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the things that we have seen is we've almost started to see some tensions that look a lot like old Cold War tensions that have started to reemerge, where those antagonistic feelings between the East and the West are kind of starting to reemerge. Now, we're talking about Israel right now and Syria, but you did just mention Russia. But we're 3.5 years into what's going on in Ukraine. But of course, a lot of the tension in Ukraine didn't start in 2022.
Right.
We don't have to go back that far before we start talking about what happened in 2014. The West was very involved in, all the actions, around Maidan, et cetera.
Right.
And it, to some degree, I do believe that what is happening in Israel is related to the Greater Israel Project. But I also, in my mind, I see that itself as a component in potentially a larger strategy as well to increase the tensions between the East and the West.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it does seem that war and conflict is a clear outcome in all this, or a goal. I brought up the map for people to see it. And we should remember too, that the patch that they're wearing, this is not some old concept. They have patches to this day that are being worn as they kill people in Gaza that show the Greater Israel map on their patch. So
that's right.
This is a very Smotrich, Ben Gvir. These are people that are very forward about it, and they're proudly telling people this is what they're doing. And it's weird how the West just pretends like this is not the most obvious thing in the world. And you can see all of them, from Iraq to Syria to it's everything. I mean, and it's all coming to pass.
Well, yeah. So in the last couple of weeks, there have also been some increasing tensions between Azerbaijan and Russia.
Okay.
And so this is interesting because a lot of Americans probably do not think a lot about Azerbaijan.
Right.
But Azerbaijan is a key player. First of all, it's in kind of this Southern Caucasus region that is very strategically important because it lies between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So you've got Azerbaijan, you have Armenia, to the direct west, you've got Georgia, Turkey's kind of right there as well in that region. And then, but Azerbaijan also, shares a border with Iran. So very close ally with Turkey, Azerbaijan is. And Azerbaijan has had a series of wars that it has fought with Armenia. So they had a war in the 90s. They had another war in 2020. And the reason I share this is because I do think that this is also somewhere where we kind of have to keep our eyes on. That's not, Azerbaijan's not exactly in the Middle East, but it's in kind of that greater region there in the South Caucasus that is not that far away, but is also potentially being used as a point of leverage to cause tensions to flare between the East and the West.
Now, if I remember correctly, Robert Inlakesh has spoke about groups that Azerbaijani groups that exist in Iran, right? That are very prominent, that he worries might be a point of manipulation from Israel's perspective, to use some of these groups from within Iran. And we recently just saw, whether it's Azerbaijan or not, but groups that were in Iran that were like cells, sleeper cells that came up and they conducted those attacks from within Iran. And so that just adds to that point that maybe that could be something Israel uses as well to create a false flag.
So I think that's a real point. And that's kind of what I'm driving at too, because Azerbaijan has demonstrated a closeness to Israel and tensions with Iran. But they are interesting because they're very closely allied with Turkey. In fact, they almost consider themselves to be you know, one people, two nations, primarily a Muslim nation. But it's really weird. If you look at the map of Azerbaijan, up until recently, they used to have an enclave within their borders called Nagorno-Karabakh, which was comprised of a bunch of Armenians that lived in this area within the Azerbaijani borders that Armenia claimed. And of course, they had several wars over that. And in the most recent conflict between the two, Azerbaijan has basically taken over that entire area. But in addition to that enclave within their borders of Armenians, Nagorno-Karabakh, they also have this other like exclave, I guess, that is another portion of their territory that is not contiguously linked to the rest of the country, and it's on the far side of Armenia. So Armenia is kind of in between the greater portion of Azerbaijan here, and then this tiny portion of Azerbaijan to Armenia's west. So a really fascinating country, even if you just look at it in terms of the map. And then it's right on the it's right on the coast of the Caspian Sea. There's a huge pipeline that runs through that South Caucasus region.
Seems strategically important.
It is strategically important, but pipelines also, first of all, they're economically vital, but pipelines are also often targets of terrorist activities, and therefore could potentially be used even in a false flag scenario as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all, you know, as we say, stay vigilant, because clearly I agree with you. I think that the logical outcome here is that Israel will do something to justify what it's. I mean, it's not a secret. They've been screaming about wanting this and having the U.S. be the group to carry it out for them for decades. I mean, on the surface. So we should definitely be keeping an eye on that. Now, the overlapping point of this, obviously, is what's going on with Gaza. You know, that clearly I genuinely think that because of the way they conducted this is why the narrative is collapsing. I mean, it's been coming for a long time, but I think they shot themselves in both feet, as we said earlier, by conducting this in the most belligerent, clumsy, obvious way ever. So show a couple things for the audience to get. This is just as of today. This is antiwar.com. Every day they're doing these reports now, and it's almost the same every day. Israeli tank strikes Gaza's only Catholic church, killing 3, injuring a priest. And what's interesting is it's a priest that the Pope has been calling daily. And now they struck this church, and you know, apparently it's causing this, rightly so, a huge international thing. Israel spoke up and said, "Oh, it was an accident," because people, you know, when it happens that it gets enough tension, they respond to it. You know, BBC reporting at least 20 killed in another incident at the GHF food lines. And every day that's happening, and 93 killed in just the last 24 hours. So, you know, what are your thoughts on you know, what's going on with that, how it's possible that it can keep continuing for a year, even though we see it? It's a crazy scenario. Yeah.
So this whole situation with Gaza has been, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Zionism. And so what is incredible to me is the degree to which you have to perform some pretty complex mental gymnastics to defend Israel's actions. But we have people that have felt a moral obligation to do so because they do believe they have to unconditionally support Israel in whatever Israel does. The second thing, and I can't remember who first said this, but somebody wrote a piece, and I don't remember who it was now, but I agree with the assertion that Gaza represents a method. And so I do believe that on a global scale, we may all find ourselves Gazans at some point. I can't remember who originally wrote a piece in which they said that, but that to me was impactful when I first came across, you know, someone said that, and I think I may have even read the piece. I just don't remember when it was, because when you look at the way in which Gazans have been treated, and the way in which many people across the globe have turned a blind eye to it, or have tried to contextualize it in some way in which you make it either less horrific or you even justify it, has been as sick as it is also just kind of in some ways like darkly insightful. And I say insightful because not insightful in a good way, but that's why I say darkly insightful, because insightful that you can make good people rationalize some pretty dark things if you find a way to do it. You know,
I took that in the sense that it's hard not to acknowledge who these people are. The insight, you know, to be able to have the, you know, insight on the reality of what, you know, just this. I mean, I rarely would use something like the word evil, because it's just not an objective term.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what else to call something
Sure.
like this, and how anybody can be, tell them call themselves a Christian Zionist or any religion or have any belief in these things, and then turn around and in any way, I don't care if every single thing they've ever said about Palestine is true, rationalize killing this many children in any way. I don't care if they are holding 75 guns each. It doesn't matter that, it is counter to their belief structure. And so that's where I think is causing one of the biggest rifts within that part of the community.
Sure.
Is they're just going like, I could have gone along with you if you had been doing this. Here's an interesting point that I think Dave Smith made in the debate a while back, is that had Israel October 7th, 8th, went right to the UN, which, like history they'd never really done, but just decided, you know what, we're going to play this differently, right to the UN and said, we were attacked. We want to go through the right channels. They would have never needed support for the rest of their life. I mean, it would have, it's so, and then they could have gone on bombing and killing, right? But just going to them and acting like they're going through the process. Instead, they went right genocide, right out of the gate, started murdering children in daylight, and people expecting the same old thing and people looking the other way, but it just jarred people, And so had they gone the right path, they clearly, they would have succeeded incredibly, but the point is it jarred these people to the point where they can't keep ignoring the moral, absence. Yeah.
So it kind of reminds me of what we were just talking about with the situation in Syria or with the Druze, et cetera. So, and then I mentioned Azerbaijan. So we may start to see two blocks kind of start to form, right? And I wonder if maybe what's going on in Syria is are we now witnessing Israel break the ceasefire without breaking the ceasefire? So in other words, we're going to initiate hostilities, but we're not going to do it directly against Iran, but we are going to reinitiate hostilities, and those hostilities eventually are going to spread.
Yeah, they did it in Lebanon. They do it. I mean, Craig Murray was highlighting that from day one, the supposed ceasefire with Lebanon. They broke that every day going forward. Nobody even talks about that. And they still never stopped it. But then same with Gaza, they broke that every time. But so like you're saying, having the conflict kind of drive out from other points. So it's like they didn't break the ceasefire.
Yeah, exactly. So they haven't launched new missiles at Iran. Now they may, just for all the reasons you just said, like, in fact, I was going to say earlier in the discussion, if we see the ceasefire broken, I think there's a much greater likelihood that it would be broken by Israel.
Yeah.
But what could be happening is that Israel is basically breaking it now. They're not technically breaking it because they're not launching Israel's or missiles at Iran, but they're engaging in hostilities that they know that some of their historic enemies are going to react to
and perceive that way.
And that's right. And they are eliciting that reaction without launching missiles directly at Iran.
There's also the point you made about reports. That's why I briefly mentioned earlier that I can't verify, I don't think anyone has yet, that there's been events that have happened since that ceasefire, bombings in certain areas that get disputed. I think even Ron has an interest in going, well, either way, we're going to claim it's not them, right? But very well, I feel makes sense. And even the way it went down was one more of these sleeper cells. And so your point being, from Iran's perspective, Israel never stopped attacking them. So I get that makes sense. But I don't think Iran has been very, they've shown restraint in more ways than I could imagine, going from Syria, any different mini dynamics, where basically showing that they will not react the way that they want them to. They're not going to be belligerent. They'll wait, like you mentioned, with the kind of possible back channel conversation. They let them move things out of Qatar. They bomb Qatar afterward. I think that they won't, is what I'm getting at. I think that they've shown restraint enough.
Now, one thing that I have heard Colonel Douglas McGregor say in various, and he's given a lot of interviews the last couple of weeks. Now, I find myself listening to him a little bit more than I used to. Because I think from a military perspective, he is very smart and he knows exactly what he's talking about. And he probably has a lot of connections. I sometimes have felt that his overall geopolitical understanding has been a little bit lacking. And I would attribute that to when you spend a long time in the military, you start to see things. And this kind of goes back to the way that I opened up the discussion, is that a lot of times military service can actually negatively impact the way that you see the world, because you get locked into this geopolitical construct in which the dominant actors on the stage are sovereign nations. And you don't tend to think of, well, who's pulling the strings behind these different nations? And even if two nations go to war, is somebody pulling the strings of the leaders of both nations, et cetera.
Right.
The military because you are you're an agent of your own government. I mean,
Mhm.
for 19 plus years, I wore a uniform that said U.S. Army.
Right.
It had a U.S. flag on it. I'm an agent of the U.S. government. So you tend to think of, well, the U.S. does this and our allies do this, and we have adversaries out there that do this.
Mhm.
But I think that's kind of a simplistic geopolitical construct.
Definitely.
So you kind of have to get away from that. So you have to, if you can use your military experience, or I would say the same thing if somebody worked in other parts of the government for a long time, if you can use that to inform the way in which you see things, give you a framework to perhaps interpret them, but get rid of the baggage that forces you or can suggest that you see things in a very limited way. So anyway, with McGregor, there are times in which I felt like he's still kind of, he has his geopolitical view here is still a little bit limited. But more recently, I've actually been more appreciative of some of the things that he said. I feel like he's kind of come out of that a little bit.
I think partisanship plays a factor.
Sure.
Yeah.
But in any case, I do think that one thing that he has been saying recently that I do think has been insightful is Israel depleted a lot of their assets of missiles. Okay. So it's a resource game. And at the end of the day, it's a math problem. If I'm launching this number of missiles and you can launch more back at me, then I may run out of missiles before you do. If you have stockpiles that are larger than mine. So what he was suggesting is there may be a couple. So let's just say perhaps there will be a period of a couple of months that actually gives Israel time to replenish their stockpiles.
I agree with that. Yeah, I saw the thought circulating as well. And I think that's at least a major part of what happened. I also think that it just was kind of a wake-up moment. I don't think Israel expected both things. I don't think they expected as much. They didn't, the attack didn't succeed the way they wanted it to. And that's, again, assuming that maybe that's the way it was supposed to go. We consider that as well. But I also don't think that if this was just a genuine back and forth, that they expected the kind of response they got or their ability to get through their defenses. I think Iran completely, if the reports are true, the Mossad headquarters, like a couple of different places they claim they bombed that Israel disputes, but it seems as if the way they responded, it was both the depletion, but also just that unless we get more support, we're not going to win this. And I think that's what a lot of very educated military minds have been saying, that unless Israel can't win this, and arguably even the U.S. wouldn't be able to with everyone else involved.
Yeah. And so if let's just assume that is true for a moment, and I'm not saying it's not, but let's just go with that for a moment. So here's what that means. So Israel's own government, or Netanyahu, whatever you want to call it, but if that's true and we look at it that way, then they engaged in some sort of strategic brinkmanship that took their country to the very edge, to the brink, and kind of basically they backed themselves into a corner so that the United States would have to get involved.
That's what it feels like.
But there are plenty of people who say that is exactly what happened.
Yeah, well, that's a very plausible outcome.
It is
none of us know,
it is plausible.
But it does make sense, especially when you look at what they've been doing over the last 70 years. Like clearly, probably even less than that, depending on when that started. But just trying to drive the United States against Iran in 1,000 different ways. So it does make sense.
Now, there's another way to look at this too. Now I understand there are debates going on right now, and I don't have an opinion on this one way or the other, but there are people out there that dispute the existence of nuclear weapons.
Okay, it's an interesting thought. I've heard that. Logic
before. I don't know. Okay, so let's just assume they're a thing. They're real for a moment. So if Israel gets into a war with Iran or with any of its neighbors that are much, much, much larger, that Israel can't defeat in a conventional war, then their threshold in which they have to go nuclear could be lower, and so that's just another dynamic that is part of this scenario as well.
Well, again, with the asterisks of the asterisk of the possibility that those don't exist, the idea is the Samson option. I'm sure you're familiar with, and the idea being, if you're not, I see Seymour Hersh wrote a book about it. The point being that Israel will. There's different disputes on overall, but launch nuclear weapons against everybody, including their allies, should they recognize they were about to fall. And that's and I've heard that supported. Even just like a Wilkerson who, has insight, or a I'm blanking on his name. Somebody who's been making the rounds, a former CIA, saying the same thing. John Kurokow, saying I've seen these people. I've watched the way their intelligence operates. There's some dark things they'll tell you, and so it just makes sense with larger pictures. But question at all, we definitely should. But all that being said, it makes sense to me that this is about them trying to drive this into reality. I think largely my gut tells me because they recognize that's where they're inching toward. The Zionism has lost its influence. People are questioning it like never before. And I think they feel they need something serious and jarring to maybe shake us away from that.
Sure. Yeah.
That terrifies me.
It is. It is. I mean, the whole idea of the Samson option is terrifying. Nuclear weapons, again, assuming they exist. And this is, I find that fascinating. But I haven't looked into it enough to make a determination one way or the other. But I understand why people, so I'm assuming this holds true for you too, but I'm far enough down this road. I've been playing this game long enough because I've been researching this type of stuff for, I don't know, since like 2007. So I no longer dismiss things just because they sound far-fetched.
Yeah.
Because
I call that intelligence.
Yeah. There are too many things that are pretty crazy that I have come to believe. Right. So anyway.
Or that you could prove, I would say too.
Yeah. So like with the whole nuclear weapons thing, just because it's kind of fun. I mean, not that nukes are fun, but just the idea, right?
Yeah, right.
Because on the one hand, I could totally see how they're not real and they've been used to create, I mean, the existence of nuclear weapons was a huge pillar in the entire geopolitical construct that existed during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Mutually assured destruction and the fact that, the United States and the Soviet Union are both, nuclear powers, et cetera. So I could kind of see why that veneer would need to be there in order to kind of prop up that.
It makes sense
construct,
to me. You can see, I mean, you could see an easy, based on what we're even seeing today, a world in which you have the Soviet Union, United States, who recognize that they're the two pillar powers of the moment and say, look, what if we just make an agreement, like to create this construct that will allow us to essentially rule over everybody. I mean, that's not that far-fetched. It's hard to wrap your mind around.
It's not.
But it comes down to the technology, which I think is definitely worth everyone's time. Everyone watching the show, question everything, right? There's some interesting points that are made. There's some very, very intelligent people over the years that have done rounds and talks everywhere where they're arguing like, look, we can prove this is not X, Y, and Z. And for me, it's hard. The only thing is there's Pearl Harbor, or rather World War II in general, and the dropping of the bombs, that there's evidence that people point to, but then there's the arguments of here's a good point to make. There's so many directions to go in that you can look at Hiroshima and that it's not, it's people, things are growing back and it's okay. My point is, well, okay, you could argue that means that it's not real. Or you could argue that we just don't understand the repercussions, or maybe we've overestimated it. It's just that there's so many nuanced points to it. But what do you think about it?
Yeah. So there are two books, which I have not had a chance to dig into yet. But one of them is, which I have the book. I've acquired the book. I just got it. I haven't read it yet. But it's by Michael Palmer, who I believe is a German MD. And I think it's called Hiroshima Revisited. I think it's Hiroshima Revisited. But so from an MD's eyes, he looks at kind of what happened in Hiroshima. Okay. And then there's another one by a Japanese author. And again, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm aware of it. Trying to get the book. I do want to read it. I think his name is Akio Nakatani, maybe. And that one is called Death Object. And then there's a subtitle, which I don't recall off the top of my head. But he also questions whether or not nukes were used in Japan. So I'm not saying they don't exist, but I am aware that there is an argument out there being made by intelligent people that, that maybe they don't, or they don't, or whatever. But there's also, so even if they do exist, technology has advanced so far in the last however many decades, right? That there are also devastating weapons that are non-nuclear. There are types of kinetic weapons now that, governments have that are very, very powerful and should be taken into consideration when we think of like a threshold that could be met, in a conventional war, where that war then passes into a new phase and very devastating weapons are used, even if non-nuclear.
Yeah. Well, going back to your point about, I forget which part, we're talking about Gaza and just in a general point about testing and manipulation. In Gaza, it's often used as a test bed for new weaponry, right? They call it battle tested and they sell it. They're killing innocent people with it. The argument being there's been, again, the question of whether that's what it was or not, but what do they call them, low yield or tactical nukes that were
Yeah.
tested in these areas. Or,
Yeah.
for example, the explosion that happened in Lebanon, in Beirut. People argue that might have been something like that they said was fertilizer, which I find impossible to believe. But there's a lot of different elements of that possibility. But to your point, just this, I mean, at some point, a large enough bomb, it's about the fallout that we're debating, because there's large enough bombs that that kill a lot of people, or even the point of like a chemical or biological weapon, which can kill a hell of a lot more people if it's done in a certain way. So the kinetic violence and damage is still there either way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there are weapons like the what they call the rod from God, which is like basically yeah. So I mean, it's like a telephone pole made of tungsten.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's fired.
I've only read about that.
Anyway, yeah. So its impact is the force created by the impact is just incredibly devastating. But it's non-nuclear.
And it's just an object, right? It's just like propelled. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, people can look into that. But it's just colloquially called the rod from God. But I was gonna say, so looking at weapons or other technology, so I do think this is important. So the military industrial complex, so this term has been around for over 60 years, right? And generally when people think of the military industrial complex, they think of these large corporations that create military hardware. I mean, someone's got to create tanks and bombs and aircraft carriers and fighter jets, munitions, who builds submarines, et cetera, right? And I think that's all important. And if we end up in a very large war, military hardware will continue to be very important. However, we do need to update our understanding of what the military industrial complex is.
Agreed.
Because in 2025, you got to understand the importance of data and metadata. And so it's not just Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, but it's also Palantir that is, gained so much notoriety recently. Anduril, there are other companies out there, like Oracle or whatever, but there are some of these that are very powerful. And these are, make no mistake, these are a crucial part of the military industrial complex nowadays.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's where it's all going, quite frankly. And there's such an important point to make right now that, I even make kind of a similar point in the point of like surveillance, that a lot of people are stuck with like, listening devices and cameras. And we are so far beyond that. It's like almost irrelevant. Your phone is right there. Or it's like Wi-Fi mapping your house. We're so far beyond this, that same kind of thing is that, we're focusing on the kinetic side of it, but people are arguing that even today that we're sort of beyond that, or even the idea of like you mentioned earlier, 5th generation warfare, as opposed to even like deploying soldiers where at this like higher, or drones, we're getting to a whole other level of this to where we need to like fundamentally change the way we perceive how these work. And point being, we can be played with those things. Like you're talking about, we could be looking at something else while the real thing's happening over here. I think it's a big part of that.
So you've probably heard, maybe you've even commented on the AI system that the Israelis use called Lavender.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or Habsora. They use it.
Yeah. Okay. So you're aware of that. Maybe even your audience has heard you talk about it, or they've heard others comment on it. And there's a lot of information out there that people can just search and they'll find about that. So two things that I want to mention. One of them is this is a lot of conjecture on my part, but I'm still going to mention it. So the Department of Defense, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, they made an announcement that they were going to decrease the number of generals and admirals that we have at the top. Now, just so people know, we have a large military. I said earlier, if you take into account all the Guard and Reserve troops, it's over 2 million. So we have a large force. So we maintain billets, just on the active duty side, we maintain billets across all services for a total of about 600 generals and admirals. Sometimes we go above that number, but we maintain about 600 billets for generals or admirals 1 to 4 star.
What's a billet?
Like a position.
Okay.
So like positions for about 600.
Okay.
Generals or admirals 1 to 4 star.
Okay.
Active duty. That's including Army, Navy, all of them. A total of about 600 guys. Whether they're a 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star. Okay, that's a lot. People have said, rightfully so, hey, our military during World War II was much larger and we had less generals and admirals at the top. Maybe we're too top heavy. Okay, great. Maybe we are. So a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was 5 or 6 weeks ago, DOD came out and said, we're going to relook this. And we're going to decrease the number of generals and admirals we have at the top. Now, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that should happen. Maybe it should have happened a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a part of me that says, okay, maybe we should. Is there another reason that they're doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And is it because we're going to get to a point where we need less human decision makers at the top?
Yes.
Now that's conjecture on my part.
Yeah.
But those are the types of questions that we at least need to entertain.
I 100% agree with that. I mean, right now it's very obvious that that's the direction that the world is going in, that the US and China seem to be driving everyone towards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, and a lot of other groups too. But so the obvious point is that they're going to have less need for people in those positions. Israel's demonstrating that right now. They're showing that,
Mm-hmm.
in the background in other conversations. But I agree with you. And I think that that's whether or not that's why that's happening.
Yep.
I absolutely agree. That's where we're going. And I think that right now, it's also, I mean, one other thought I would add to it is that it also might just be that there are people with certain mindsets in leadership that might be a problem with where things go.
Yeah.
That'd be my conjecture.
Yeah. So I totally understand all of the quote unquote normal and maybe even positive reasons as to why you might reduce the top heaviness of our force. I totally get it. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's all it is. Mm-hmm. But because I trust so little of what the government does, to include the military, I have to ask, some of these hard questions of, okay, but is there, because it's easy for them to sell the idea. They can easily sell the idea.
Or to your point, it could be both.
It could be both.
Right.
But here's another dot. So also a couple of weeks ago, the Army put out that there were 4 guys from the tech world, but specifically AI, that they were going to bring into the military. And they, and these 4 guys, no military experience, no prior military experience. They all come from, important AI corporations. And these guys have been commissioned as lieutenant colonels in the Army Reserves. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the military, let me explain why this is so weird. Okay. So DOD, so the terms DOD, the Department of Defense, and the military, they're like mostly synonymous. You can kind of use them interchangeably, but they're not exact synonyms. And DOD is technically larger than the military, okay? Because you have a lot of civilians that work for DOD. So even I sometimes use the terms interchangeably, but they're not exactly synonymous. And you can be a civilian who works for DOD. There are many civilians who do work for DOD. So do we have engineers that work in research and development? Yeah, sure. Do we have other scientists or other guys that come from a very technically nuanced background that are employed by DOD? They work full-time for DOD? Yes, of course. People know about DARPA,
right?
Or anyway, okay. My point is, if you want to let's assume that you think, well, we have to be on the cutting edge of AI because our adversaries are whatever. Let's assume we accept that argument, right? And then I can understand why you would say within the DOD apparatus, we need smart guys that are on the cutting edge of AI. Okay. But why do they have to have ranks? Why do they have to wear the uniform?
Right.
So here is the one thing that I can think of, and I know I'm not the only person to say this. There may be other reasons, but the one thing that stands out at me is guys who are in the military are now in the structure of giving and receiving orders. And so they can now give orders. Right. Now they're not active duty. They're in the reserves. But in terms of being a lieutenant colonel, the way the military looks at that is if you're a lieutenant colonel, you're a lieutenant colonel. Right. It doesn't matter whether you're in the reserves, whether you're in the guard, or whether you're active duty. And so like I was a lieutenant colonel and I served for 19 years and 4 years at West Point before that. And it took me 17 years to make lieutenant colonel. And these guys have made it with no military experience whatsoever. And so now they're at so if you're in the Army and you're a lieutenant colonel, what does that mean? That means you outrank far, far more people than outrank you. Yeah. The only people who outrank you are generals, 1 to 4 star, or colonels. So anyway, so again, I think this is something that we got to keep an eye on. Like what's going on here?
I 100% agree. It's funny that that was going to be the point that I wanted to finish up. So this is, I'm glad you bring it up. And honestly, we already pretty much went over that general point. And I did a show on this. I simply called it Detachment 201, Technocracy in Uniform.
Yeah.
Right. That's how I see this, is that really, I mean, we've all been talking, I mean, you mentioned Palantir, the idea of, even if you don't like the word technocracy, just an idea of like these technological, the way they view themselves, elites, technological elitists who think that they know better, and there's a whole weird overlap with eugenics to all this. The point is that, as you're highlighting, you have Palantir's CTO, Meta, and OpenAI, right, becoming lieutenant colonels. It blew my mind. That was the point that I highlighted as well. Military uniform. I mean, this is the exact thing that I've been watching for, is the transition away from the current structure into, people like this being actual, whether politicians or actual military enforcers. I mean, that's where we are now.
Yeah.
And so I'm very worried about where this is going and whether we're watching. Let's just end on this point. Do you think that this is bigger than just a transition and more so about some kind of a coup?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Okay. Let me ask what you mean. A coup by whom, against whom?
Well, it's again, just one thought of it. The way I framed it in a recent show was the Zionist technocratic coup of the United States. So I see a multifaceted kind of a thing going on with, again, as we kind of discussed earlier, that a lot of these things are in line, but not all in the same line with everything, right? But I would argue, if we're talking about it specifically in that point, it would be some kind of technocratic elitist structure. Yeah. In this case, I could see a Palantir overlap, the Mark Andreessens and Karps and Anduril, these kind of groups that are, for a very long time have had a hell of a lot of influence on politics, who have, for whatever reason, decided they have enough momentum, enough control and influence to just essentially take over. Sure. And so what I'm seeing is the Elon Musk representation, as well as OpenAI, but then Palantir, JD Vance, like through this administration. Yep. And I add Zionism because I think it's part and parcel with this. It's same with the globalist idea, but that general structure sort of taking this, like, this is the administration where they're shifting into place. That's how I would look at it. But in a broad way, it's hard.
Yeah, it's a good question. So here's what I would say. A couple thoughts. I don't entirely disagree. I think it's a good question. There are maybe some points of that I might quibble with. So, and the reason I asked the question, a coup by whom, against whom, and even with that, the important part of that is the against whom. So I kind of think that we have been undergoing like a coup arc for a long period of time. And I think that coup arc is punctuated by certain discrete events that occur along that arc. We could look at, obviously the COVID operation. We could look at 9/11. We could look at even things like the assassination of JFK. If you want to go back further, you could look at things like, 1913 and the Fed, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But there are these, so the coup arc has been around for a long time, but then there are these discrete events that like move us into a new phase of the arc. So in that regard, I don't know if I would necessarily characterize this. I mean, you might be right, but I'm just thinking where I might quibble a little bit is I don't know if I would characterize this as a kind of a one and done type coup, but it could definitely be another one of these events along an already existing coup arc that takes us into a new phase. Yeah. And that I would not disagree with, because I do believe that we are moving into a phase of technocracy. And you mentioned, hey, maybe people out there take issue with the word technocracy, and maybe they do, but I don't. Yeah. That's the word that I use. Right. I mean, they're self-avowed technocrats.
It's more about maybe people maybe don't understand what it means in the fullest of sense, or that we've been propagandized against it. Yeah. But I think it's obviously a very real thing tonight.
I mean, they, like I said, many of them self-describe. And I also think that there is that technocracy and transhumanism, there is an inextricable link between those two.
I agree.
And in fact, just by way of maybe kind of wrapping up this whole discussion, I'll give a book recommendation out there for people. And it's actually a work of fiction. So people, I have long said people got to read. Like Americans, we don't read enough.
Yes.
And also, when you read, you can't just read articles. And I'm not saying articles are bad. I mean, I write a lot of Substack posts and people write great op-eds. That's not my point. But you have to read books, because a book is different than even a very scholarly, well-defended article. Because the argumentation that you put into place in a 300-page book or whatever, right, compared to even a very dense, information-rich, very well put together article, it's still very different. And as Americans, a lot of people are losing the intellectual stamina to read a book.
Wow.
And I, for a long time, was reading almost exclusively nonfiction. And I still read more nonfiction than fiction. But I've started to go back and read more fiction. I think there's a lot that you can read in fiction that will supplement what you're reading in nonfiction.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So recently, over the last 2 years or so, I've been reading a lot of the dystopian literature. Now, I had read 1984 previously, okay? But that's like the granddaddy of the dystopian works, right? Okay. So if you haven't read 1984, read 1984, but that's not actually my book recommendation. I'm building up to it. If you haven't read Brave New World, read that one too, because you need to understand like the hard approach and the soft approach. Now there are different, and Brave New World represents that kind of soft approach, you know, where you grow to love your servitude. Now there are people who will tell you that, you know, George Orwell, whose real name was Eric Blair, or Aldous Huxley, they will tell you, hey, these guys aren't so much warning you as much as they are globalists and they're telling you the insider plan. Not my point. Regardless, they are still very, very valuable. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, you know, a great book. In fact, of those three, that one's probably my favorite. But there is another one that people are less familiar with. And it came out of Russia in the 1920s. It's a 100-year-old novel, and it's called We, W-E.
I've heard of that.
Okay. So there are a couple reasons why I would recommend that people read it, and particularly right now. So it predates 1980, well, both Brave New World and 1984. So I think Brave New World was published in 1932, and 1984 was either in 48 or 49.
I forget, yeah.
But and then Fahrenheit 451 was in the early 50s, maybe 53. But We is from the early 20s. I think it was published in 1924. So it was written in the Russian Revolution during that time period by a Russian author named Yevgeny Zamyatin. And the manuscript was smuggled out of the Soviet Union and was actually published first in the United States, I think in 1924.
It's funny. I think I've only heard this once, but it's ringing true. I've heard this vague story.
Yeah.
This out.
So I'll explain why it's important. So first of all, it's written kind of in these early years of what would become the Soviet Union. And in fact, supposedly it was the first work that was actually censored by the Soviet Union. So obviously the manuscript is written in Russian, but it's first published in English. And I believe, if I remember this correctly, the first copies in Russian of the novel weren't from the original manuscript, but they were Russian translations of the English translation of the original manuscript. It'd be interesting to compare those two in Russian. Anyway,
interesting.
It would not actually be published in the Soviet Union until the 80s. So, 60 years after it was written. But why is this so important? So, first of all, George Orwell said that he was influenced heavily by this novel. And the two plot lines are actually quite similar. But the novel, what it posits is a futuristic society. It's called One State, but it is ruled by basically math, like mathematical principles. Okay. So in that way, what you would say is it is a society kind of as utilitarian as you could get, as rationalistic as you could get, and mathematically optimized, And so the protagonist in the novel, who has no name, he goes by D503. So all the characters in the novel, they don't have names. They just go by like a combination of letters and numbers.
Oh, interesting.
And he's D503. He is a mathematician, but more specifically, he's a spaceship engineer. Okay. Anyway, I'm not going to tell any more about the plot, just because I do think people should read it. But this novel is 100 years old. And there are moments in the novel that are quite philosophical, where you start talking about the importance of math and what it means to regiment a society along mathematical principles. But if you were to update that thought, modernize that thought by a century, and you look at where we're at now, well, we would call that governance by algorithm or governance by AI. I mean, that is where we are headed. What does the algorithm tell the state that it should do, et cetera? So anyway,
very interesting.
These are some 100-year-old ideas that I think should resonate with us now. So anyway, so I offer that out there for everybody listening. So Yevgeny Zamyatin is the author. You can easily find it. The name of the novel again is We.
Well, thanks for the recommendation. I'm definitely going to check that out. A couple ending thoughts. Derek wrote an article called Doge, Is Efficiency a Gateway to Technocracy? I used Elon Musk's face over, I forget his first name. Name was Taylor. He was responsible for what's called Taylorism, which was a precursor to technocracy and the efficiency movement. And so it's interesting, if you look back to that point, it's the same idea. It's about, he carried a pocket watch and would walk around like timing people and just trying to shave off seconds. And it's kind of an interesting overlap, as well as the point, just to give someone an article, or rather a show to watch based on that last point. James Corbett did a show called Algocracy, Government for the New World Order.
Right.
And it's just about governments by algorithm.
That's
and
right.
I recently actually did a show too called, it was called The Impending Future of AI Government, but then the kind of additional point behind it was, but who controls the AI?
Sure,
right?
sure.
So it's just, I'm with you, man. We're going in a very dangerous direction, and it seems that regardless of the flavor, all the power structures are going in that direction. You know? So that's kind of the larger point again, that it seems like we're just being played off each other to get to a point to the power structures want.
That's right. That's right.
But it's such an insightful conversation, man. I always enjoy talking with you. I think that this, gives people kind of a glimpse into the way you see the world, and you see things and have understood things and been involved with things that a lot of people haven't. And so I really appreciate you giving us that insight, having this conversation. We should definitely do it again. Anything else you want to leave anybody with before we wrap up today?
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, just as we talk about that, is, with this novel, it's what you can't argue against math.
Yeah.
Math is immutable.
Right.
And you can already see people are making the same arguments now, but you can already see how the narrative writes itself. You can't argue against the AI.
Right.
So it is a brave new world that we are moving into. I have heard that term algocracy that you mentioned that Corbett had used. So yeah, we got to keep our eyes open. It's important that we're constantly refining our strategic assessments so that we can, because things are moving really fast.
Yeah. And
I don't think they're going to slow down. So anyway, thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here in studio with you once again. And thanks for all you do, brother.
Thanks, man. And I'll leave us with a thought, and feel free to comment, since that we didn't get into this, of Elon's America Party and kind of that direction. And people are already going like AI algorithm, like that maybe that's where they go with that. Cause you could see a portion of the population that would, based, just like we were saying before, because they're only focused on the current problems, go like, yes, that seems like a solution to what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah.
So that's, as always, guys, question everything. We have to be in a position where we are critical of everything, including what we think we know. And, this is just why it's important. And I'm glad that, you've been on this path for a long time, brother, and I'm honored to be here talking with you. So thanks again.
Likewise. Thanks, man.
As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow.